Italy was never meant to disappear from basketball. This was a country that played in Olympics finals, won European championships, built some of the strongest club teams the continent had ever seen. For decades, Italy didn't rely on hype or raw talent. They relied on control, on structure, on knowing exactly how to win tight games. And then quietly, they stopped mattering. No collapse, no scandal, just a slow fade into the background. Today, Italy still qualifies, still competes, but they don't shape the sport anymore. So how did one of Europe's smartest basketball nations fall behind, while others rebuilt, modernized, and surged ahead? To answer that, we have to go back to when Italian basketball was actually ahead of its time. Before Italy fell behind, they were one of Europe's reference points. From the 1970s through the early 90s, Italian basketball wasn't chasing legitimacy. It already had it. The national team regularly competed for medals, reaching Olympic finals and winning Eurobasket titles. Italy wasn't dominant every year, but they were always there. The real power, though, came from the domestic league. Series A was once the strongest basketball league in Europe. Clubs like Olimpia Milano, Virtus Bologna, Cantu, and Benetton Treviso weren't feeder teams, they were destinations. Top American players came to Italy in their prime. And European stars stayed. That mattered because Italian players were exposed to elite basketball without leaving home. At the center of this era was Dino Minighin, the most important figure in Italian basketball history. Tough, disciplined, and relentlessly professional. Became the model for what Italian basketball valued. Intelligence over flash, control over chaos. Coaches like Valerio Bianchini built teams around that philosophy. Games slowed down, mistakes were punished, and in tight moments, Italy usually found a way to win. Internationally, the results followed. Eurobasket gold in 1983, consistent podium finishes, and an Olympic silver medal run in 1980 reinforced the idea that Italy's system worked. For a long time it did. But Italy's success was built for a specific version of basketball, one where experience outweighed athleticism, and half-court executions decided the game. As long as the game looked like that, Italy thrived. The problem was, basketball didn't stay that way. By the mid-90s, the sport began to speed up. Other countries adapted. Italy didn't feel the urgency. They were still winning, still respected. Without realizing it, that comfort planted the seeds of everything that came next. Because while Italy was protecting what made them successful, the rest of the basketball world was preparing to move past it. By the early 2000s, Italian basketball was still standing, but it wasn't moving. For decades, Serie A had been the engine of the entire system. It paid well, attracted elite foreign players, and gave Italian talent daily exposure to high-level competition. Then the landscape changed. Spain modernized the ACB. France restructured its league around athletic development. Eastern Europe created the Adriatic League. Italy didn't respond with reform. They responded with caution. Financial instability hit several historic clubs, and survival became the priority. Coaches were hired to keep teams afloat, not to develop the future. Winning now mattered more than building later. This is where a quiet shift happened. Italian clubs stopped trusting young Italian players. Instead of giving real minutes to prospects between 18 and 22, teams leaned on experienced foreign veterans. Players who had already understood professional basketball and wouldn't make mistakes. From a short-term perspective, it worked. From a developmental perspective, it stalled an entire generation. Young Italians stayed on rosters but not on the court. They learned systems but not pressure. By the time they reached their mid-20s, many were already labeled as role players. And the Italian Basketball Federation never forced the issue. Unlike Germany, which mandated domestic players, Italy left development to the market, and the market chose safety. League style froze as well. Serie A remained slow, tactical, and conservative, even as international basketball accelerated. Italy didn't collapse, they plateaued. The league stayed respectable, but its edge was gone. And that plateau created a bigger problem, one that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with how Italy was actually building its players. Because the league wasn't just falling behind the game, it was preparing players for a version of basketball that no longer existed. Even as the league stalled, Italy believed in its development system, and on paper it made sense. Italian youth basketball continued to emphasize fundamentals, spacing, ball movement, reading the game. Coaches were well trained and players grew up understanding structure better than almost anyone in Europe. The problem was, the game changed faster than the system did. Modern basketball began rewarding speed, power, and versatility. Wings got bigger, guards got stronger. Bigs learned to switch, run, and space the floor. Italy didn't adjust early enough. Strength and conditioning became an afterthought. Explosiveness wasn't prioritized at younger ages. Athletic development often came late, after players were already professionally labeled. By the time Italian prospects reached international competition, the gap was obvious. They knew where to be. They just couldn't get there fast enough. This wasn't about effort or intelligence, it was structural. Countries like France invested heavily in physical development at the youth level. Germany modernized training methods and sports science integration. Italy stayed rooted in a philosophy built for a slower game. Even at the national training level, basketball competed for attention and funding. The sport never received the same modernization push as others under Italy's broader sports governance. So Italy kept producing players who looked comfortable domestically, but struggled when the tempo rose. They could survive qualifiers, they could execute systems, but against elite opponents, they were exposed physically. Italy wasn't failing to teach basketball. They were teaching basketball for the past. And that mismatch became impossible to hide once the global game and the NBA entered the picture. If this breakdown is making sense so far, take a second to subscribe. This channel isn't about highlights or hot takes. It's about why countries rise, why others fall behind, and how basketball systems actually work behind the scenes. We post deep dives like this every week. The next chapters explain how Italy's problems weren't just developmental, they were structural, cultural, and avoidable. Now let's keep going. By the 2000s, there was no avoiding it. If a basketball country wanted to stay relevant, it needed a connection to the NBA. Spain had it, France had it, even smaller countries were finding ways to plug in. Italy never did. That doesn't mean Italian players never reached the NBA. Marco Bellinelli and Danilo Gallinari proved that Italian talent could survive at the highest level. Bellinelli became a champion. Gallinari had a long, productive career. But here's the problem. They weren't products of a pipeline, they were exceptions. There was no system designed to identify elite prospects early, push them into higher environments, and prepare them for NBA athleticism and pace. Italian players often stayed in Serie A too long, developing in a league that was no longer aligned with the modern game. By the time they faced NBA-level competition, the adjustment was brutal. As a result, NBA interest faded. Scouts stopped coming regularly. Italian prospects stopped appearing in draft conversations. And without that external pressure, domestic standards slipped even further. In countries like France or Germany, NBA attention forces evolution. It exposes weaknesses early. It raises expectations across the entire system. Italy didn't have that feedback loop, so the league kept producing players for itself, not for the global game. And once you fall out of the NBA conversation, climbing back in becomes incredibly difficult. Italy wasn't feeding the top of the sport anymore. They were developing in isolation. Ironically, what hid this problem for years was the one thing that made Italy look stable from the outside: the national team. For a long time, Italy didn't look like a country in decline. They qualified for tournaments. They won games they were supposed to win. They even pulled the occasional upset. From the outside, everything looked fine. And that's exactly what made the problem harder to see. Instead of forcing renewal, the national team leaned on experience. Veterans like Marco Bellinelli, Gigi Datome became the backbone of Italy's international identity well into their 30s. They were smart, reliable, professional. They kept Italy competitive, but they also delayed the inevitable. Young players weren't replacing them, they were waiting behind them. Instead of being given responsibility early, prospects were protected, eased in, and rarely asked to lead. So Italy stayed respectable, while the pipeline quietly dried up. When that veteran generation finally faded, there was no clear next wave. No stars ready to step in, no athletic leap forward, no identity to fall back on. The results didn't collapse overnight, but the ceiling dropped. Italy went from a team that could dream of medals to a team hoping for a favorable draw. The decline wasn't dramatic, it was gradual, and by the time it was obvious, it was already too late. And while this was happening on the court, something else was slipping away off it: basketball's place in Italian culture. Basketball in Italy didn't just fall behind tactically, it fell behind culturally. Italy has always been a football country, but for decades, basketball carved out its own space. Strong clubs, visible stars, and regular national team moments that kept the sport relevant. That space slowly disappeared. Media coverage shrank, youth participation declined, sponsorship money moved elsewhere. Unlike France or Germany, Italy never launched a coordinated national basketball push. There was no centralized academy system, no long-term development blueprint backed by government funding, no unified vision connecting grassroots basketball to the professional level. Basketball existed, but it wasn't prioritized. At the institutional level, responsibility was fragmented. Clubs focused on survival, the Italian Basketball Federation focused on qualification, and the broader sports governance system never treated basketball as a growth investment. Without consistent visibility, kids stopped dreaming of basketball futures. Without heroes, the pipeline thinned even further. Meanwhile, countries with less history were investing aggressively, building modern facilities, funding youth programs, and aligning their systems with the global game. Italy stayed reactive, and in modern sports, reacting is the fastest way to fall behind. The result is what we see today. Italy isn't terrible. They're not embarrassing. They're just distant. From the elite, from innovation, from the future of the sport. Which brings us to the final question. Is this decline permanent, or is there still a way back? Italy isn't bad at basketball because the country forgot how to play. They're bad because the system stopped moving. The knowledge is still there, the coaching base still exists, the infrastructure hasn't disappeared. What's missing is alignment. Italy built a system that once worked perfectly for its era. A league-first model, veteran stability, tactical control. But when the game evolved, that system didn't evolve with it. Other countries adapted. Germany enforced domestic development. France modernized athletic pipelines. Spain blended youth minutes with elite competition. Italy stayed comfortable, and comfort in modern basketball is dangerous. The truth is, Italy doesn't need a miracle generation to return. They don't need to reinvent the sport. What they need is reform, structural, not emotional. Domestic player mandates that force opportunity, early athletic development that matches the modern game, a real NBA-facing pathway that exposes weaknesses early, and a national vision that treats basketball as something to grow, not just maintain. Until that happens, Italy will be producing smart players for a game that no longer exists. They'll keep qualifying but not contending, competing but not shaping, present but irrelevant. Italy's fall wasn't loud, which is why it went unnoticed for so long. And whether they rise again won't depend on nostalgia or history. It'll depend on whether they finally accept a hard truth. Basketball didn't leave Italy behind. Italy chose not to chase it. And in a sport that never stops evolving, standing still is the same as falling.